Hello, hello everyone. Nice to have you all. Sorry we're keeping you from your lunch, but hopefully we've got a little bit of fun before that with you today. I'm Pratt, this is Harriet Jack, but for the next 10-15 minutes we're going to be Detective Pratt and Detective Jack, and we're going to take you through the case of the missing workers. So let's jump in. So what do we mean by missing workers and why is this important? So we're really talking about understanding people and place geographically and across time. And if we're thinking about workers in the sense of where people go, different times of day, the profiles of these people, how can we really understand that? And we could be many different types of businesses and organizations where this is relevant and an important question for them to answer. We could be a coffee chain who wants to understand why they sell certain different coffee in certain times of day, or where they might put their next coffee shop. We could be, say, a shopping center. They want to make sure that they have the right mix of stores, restaurants, etc., to serve those people most effectively across all times of day. But we equally could also be a local government. We could be talking about transportational planning. We could be talking about designing urban environments in the most effective and seamless way. So this is a really important question to understand. And we've already heard a little bit from BT this morning, how they talked about mobility data and understanding movement and why that's important to them too. So yeah, very important question that we're asked a lot about. Now, if we think back around why this is actually quite a difficult problem and why the workers are missing, for a long time, people would go back to the census data in this country. It's the only time in which you actually survey the entire country and ask questions like where you live, but also where do you work, and having that complete picture. But 2021 was a bit of a strange year, as many people remember, and obviously in a pandemic, and so there's some flaws around that data. And so you'd actually need to go back to 2011 in order to get a clean representation using something that would profile and ask questions for the whole country. Now, if we look at three areas, and we're going to talk about this as we come through the slides to come, but this is Wellington Street in Leeds, this is Media City in Manchester, and this is Shoreditch in London. You can see that it looks very different between 2011 and more recent images in 2021. Clearly, there has been a lot of development in these areas, and clearly office workers you would expect to be there. But in that 2011 data, unsurprisingly, you see huge gaps where we're not seeing that data capture worker populations today. And I've already mentioned some of the challenges with using 2021. Asking questions of where do you work, what's your place of work during the middle of a pandemic is not particularly helpful. Most people reported that they work from home. It was a big increase since 2011. And particularly when we look at professional services, the majority of us said that we work from home. So how do we use other sources of data and information to get a cleaner picture and representation of worker populations? And that's where I'm going to pass over to Detective Jack, who will take you through that now.
Thank you, Detective Pratt. Yeah, so we needed to come up with a master plan in order to solve this case. So firstly, we looked to postcode employment data. So this is data collected at a business level, which allows us to understand how many workers are usually present on site. This then allows us to locate the hotspots of where those workers are, and also understand what types of industry are dominant in those areas and what kind of business sizes are prevalent. We're also looking at mobile app data, as Matt's mentioned, so using geolocation data, which is collected from apps on mobile devices, to understand the location and movement of people. We're then able to define and isolate the workers. So we have the common evening location and the common daytime location of a device. And using the hex level pings that we see in this data, we can define and isolate who we think the workers are within that. We can then understand where they are, when they're coming, where they're coming from, and most importantly, who they are by depending on our geodemographic classification, ACORN. So, as suspected from the CCTV, we do in fact have workers present here. So using the postcode employment data, we're able to see that in both Leeds and Manchester, there are around 7,000 workers normally present. And this is 3 times the average worker count of a typical city centre location. Not surprisingly, this is much higher in Shoreditch in London at over 16,000 workers, which is around 8 times higher than we might expect in a city centre. We can also dive in a bit more to the data and understand about the makeup of these locations and these worker hubs. So Leeds and Manchester, both dominated by large industries with over more than 200 employees, whereas Shoreditch has a more micro startup culture dominated by small and micro businesses. Now, this can be important for understanding how we plan in these places. Do we want to focus on large-scale infrastructure and scalability, or are we thinking about flexibility and community? When can we catch them? So we can find these workers by having a look at the footfall levels that we see between the workers that we've identified and the non-worker footfall. So we see that, as conveniently teed up earlier by BT talk, we see that footfall of workers is higher from Tuesday, Wednesday, and peaking on Thursdays. Again, useful for understanding planning of things like stock, staffing, and opening hours. Now, how far are the workers travelling? So in all of these places, city centre, worker hub locations, we see that the average workers are travelling further than in other places, as demonstrated by the black line. So it's highest in Shoreditch, not surprisingly, people travelling in from much further afield, and particularly with only coming in 3 days a week, people making those decisions to live that bit further out and travel in on 3 days. In other locations, we might see much shorter distances where people live in a small town and just travel into their high street. We can pick out that that's their kind of their universe of kind of where they're living and working. So who are our suspects? So using the mobile data, as I say, we're able to understand the home location of the device and therefore append on our ACORN classification and start to understand a bit more about these workers. So in Leeds, we've spotted an 18 to 34-year-old graduate analyst who's living in a house share in Headingley and was last seen drinking a Guinness in Leeds Wetherspoons. Over in Manchester, we've got an 18 to 34-year-old social media intern who's privately renting a flat in Manchester and is prevalent on TikTok. And finally, in Shoreditch, we've got a 25 to 44-year-old highly paid professional who's recently purchased a home in Balham and is last seen reading The Guardian in a Pratt. So putting all of this data together, we're able to put together a worker identity dossier so that we can really understand who these people are when they're interacting with these spaces as workers. So we can understand things like the core demographics of these people, their life stage and financial situation, but even more we can dive into the channels that we can interact with them through, their media habits, their lifestyle patterns, as well as their brand and people affinities. So with that, I'll pass back to Matt to talk to you about how we put this all together.
Fantastic, thank you.
Okay.
So what we're now really talking about is bringing a lot of these different data sets or ways of looking at it together. And there's lots of different ways that we can do that. In this example, we're looking at through the lens of a dashboard, and we're looking at through just this worker data that we've been talking about. And so we could be looking at the top left map here, which is showing at a very precise geographic point where volumes of workers and counts of workers are predicted across these locations, in this case in London Shoreditch. We can see the types of employment that those people are in. We can see the demographics of those people as well. So we're not just looking through the lens of the demographics of where people live, which is how I think traditionally a lot of people have viewed geodemographics and segmentation. It's very much tagged to mobility data, and it's about these people actually visiting, working, or shopping, or tourism, or these different lenses of understanding it in a more transient way. This, in this case, is shown through a dashboard, and it's shown just through this lens of the worker. I think really where this data comes to life, and it gets very exciting, is where you embed it in cloud systems, you democratize it to users, but you also use it in conjunction with lots and lots of other data sets as well. You can see how we've managed to talk about these three areas quite succinctly and quite easily, because we also have complete pictures of point of interest. We know where all the shops are, we know the restaurants are, we've clustered them, and we can map mobility data against them very seamlessly. And if we're then using things like, say, the coffee shop example we talked about earlier, understanding workers but tying it in with the lens of other data sets allows us to build more powerful machine learning models and get to higher levels of accuracy because the data that sits behind it is robust and it is granular. So hopefully we can all agree we've cracked the case. If we come back to those 3 examples that we talked about earlier, we've got 3 very happy businesses that are able to identify workers better, whether it is that coffee shop business, where do I put my next shop, how do I understand and predict why I sell more coffee in one location versus another, whether I've optimized the mix of stores or restaurants that I have, or whether I'm able to plan my urban environments more effectively, transportation systems, or whatever it may be. So thank you very much for listening to us. Right.